Natural bubbling or sparkling mineral waters have been popular for thousands of years. Manufactured sparkling water has been around ever since a clergyman suspended water over a vat of fermenting beer. For centuries, carbonated water has been considered capable of relieving gastrointestinal symptoms, including tummy aches, but we didn't have good data until this study was published. 21 folks with dyspepsia, an upset stomach, and constipation were randomized into two groups in a double-blind fashion to drink 1.5 quarts of carbonated water versus tap water every day for 2 weeks. Dyspepsia was defined as pain or discomfort located in the upper abdomen, including bloating and nausea. And carbonated water improved dyspepsia compared to still water, compared to tap, and improved constipation. Drink more water is a common recommendation for constipation, but they didn't observe a clear benefit of the added tap water. It seems you have to increase fiber and water rather than just fiber alone, but sparkling water seemed to help. Now they were using a sparkling mineral water, and so whether these effects are due to the bubbles or minerals, we can't tell from this study. There's been a concern that carbonated beverages may increase heartburn, GERD, acid reflux, but this was based on studies like this that compared water to Pepsi. Soda can put the Pepsi in dyspepsia and contribute to heartburn, but so may tea and coffee in people that suffer from heartburn. This may be partly due to the cream and sugar, though, since milk is a common contributor to heartburn as well. Carbonated water alone, though, shouldn't be a problem. Similarly, while flavored sparkling drinks can erode our enamel, it's not the carbonation, but the added juices and acids. Sparkling water alone appears 100 times less erosive than citrus or soda, so a sparkling mineral water may successfully treat a stomachache and constipation without adverse effects. Unless you're a teenage boy, opening a bottle of sparkling water with your teeth, especially on a hot day after you shake it up, placing one at risk for a pneumatic rupture of the esophagus. Ever since the 1920s, doctors have been injecting arthritis patients with gold. Evidently, gold-based medicines have been in use for thousands of years, and remarkably are still in clinical use today as so-called disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, meaning they can slow the progression of rheumatoid arthritis. Unfortunately, such drugs can be toxic, even fatal, causing conditions such as gold lung, gold-induced lung disease. Although its use can be limited by the incidence of serious toxicity, injectable gold has been shown to be beneficial, but maybe, some researchers suspected, some of that benefit is the sesame oil that's injected, which is used as a liquid carrier for the gold. Sesame seeds contain anti-inflammatory compounds with names like sesamin and sesamol, which researchers suggest may serve as a potential treatment for various inflammatory diseases, but these were in vitro studies. First we have to see if there's an anti-inflammatory effect in people, not just cells in a petri dish. But there hasn't been any studies on the effects of sesame seeds on inflammatory markers in people with arthritis, for example, until now. Considering the high prevalence of osteoarthritis, and since until now there hasn't been any human studies to evaluate the effect of sesame seeds in osteoarthritis patients, this study was designed to assess the effect of the administration of sesame seeds on inflammation. They found a significant drop in inflammatory markers, but what effect did this have on the actual disease? 50 patients with osteoarthritis of the knee were split into two groups: standard treatment, or standard treatment plus about a quarter cup of sesame seeds a day for 2 months. Before they started, they described their pain as about 9 out of 10, where 0 is no pain, 10 is the maximum pain tolerable. After 2 months, the control group felt a little better, pain down to 7, but the sesame group dropped down to a 3.5, significantly lower than the control group. The researchers conclude that sesame appeared to have a positive effect, improving clinical signs and symptoms in patients with knee osteoarthritis. But the main problem with this study is that the control group wasn't given a placebo, and it's hard to come up with some kind of fake sesame seed. But without a placebo, they basically compared doing nothing extra to doing something extra, and anytime you have patients do something special, you can't discount the placebo effect. But what are the downsides? I mean, that's the nice thing about using food as medicine. Only good side effects. Though the results are mixed, there have been studies using placebo controls that found that adding sesame seeds to one's diet may improve our cholesterol and antioxidant status, and the amount of sesamin found in as little as about 1 tablespoon of sesame seeds can modestly lower blood pressure a few points within a month, enough perhaps to lower fatal stroke and heart attack risk by about 5%, potentially saving thousands of lives. Yes, we live in a so-called obesogenic environment, cheap junk food everywhere, thanks in part to subsidies going to the food industrial complex, which manufactures obesogenic foods that foster addiction. The root causes may make obesity difficult to escape, but look, a lot of people do. If it was just the external environment, why isn't everyone obese? Some individuals seem to be more susceptible than others. This suggests a genetic component supported by studies of twins and adopted kids, but the genes we've identified only account for maybe 6 to 11% of the variation in body mass index between individuals. So maybe variation in our other genome may be playing a role. All the different microbes that inhabit our body. We have 100 times more bacterial genes inside us than human genes. What this study found is that people tend to fall into one of two groups: those who have lots of different types of bacteria in their gut, so-called high gut bacteria richness, and those with relatively few types. And those with low bacterial richness had more overall body fat, insulin resistance, the cause of type 2 diabetes, high triglycerides, and higher levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, compared to high bacterial richness individuals. And not only did folks with lower bacterial richness start out heavier, but the obese individuals with lower bacterial richness also gained more weight over time. The question then becomes, can a dietary intervention have any impact? They tried a calorie-restricted diet, which by definition isn't very sustainable, but what we can do is increase our fruit and vegetable intake, which is associated with high bacterial richness. One of a number of studies that have associated increased microbial richness with diets higher in fruits, vegetables, and fiber. Now, just giving fiber-type supplements didn't seem to boost richness, but the compositional complexity of a whole food, like whole grains, could potentially support a wider scope of bacterial types, thereby leading to an increase in diversity. But human studies to investigate the effects of whole grains have been neglected until now. Folks were given whole grain barley, brown rice, or both for a month, and they did cause an increase in bacterial community diversity. Therefore, it may take a broad range of substrates to increase bacterial diversity, and this can be achieved by eating whole plant foods. And the alterations of gut bacteria in the study coincided with a drop in systemic inflammation in the body. See, we used to think that the way fiber and whole grains helped us is by gelling in our small intestines right off the stomach, slowing the rate at which sugars are absorbed, blunting the spike in blood sugars one might get from refined carbs, but now we know the fiber is broken down in our colon by our friendly flora, which release all sorts of beneficial substances into our bloodstream that can have anti-inflammatory effects as well. So maybe what's happening in our large intestine helps explain the protective effects of whole grain foods against type 2 diabetes. And interestingly, the combination of both barley and brown rice worked better than either alone, suggesting a synergistic effect. This may help explain the discrepancy of the health effects of whole grains obtained in population-based versus interventional studies. Observational studies strongly suggest that those who consume 3 servings of whole grains a day tend to have a lower body mass index, less belly fat, less tendency to gain weight. But recent clinical trials where you randomize people to eat white bread rolls versus whole wheat rolls, failed to provide evidence of a beneficial effect on body weight. Of course, whole grains are so superior nutritionally that they should still continue to be encouraged, but maybe the interventional trials failed to show weight benefits because they focused on a limited selection of whole grains, while in the population study, subjects are more likely to consume a diverse set of whole grains, which might have synergistic activities. Since the beginning of time, pregnant women have been known to suffer nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. The term morning sickness is actually misleading, since women can feel sick all day long, and sometimes it can get so serious women have to be hospitalized. Researchers at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital found that saturated fat seemed to be a primary dietary risk factor for severe sickness, 5 times the odds for each 15 grams intake of saturated fat, like a quarter-pound cheeseburger's worth. The reason saturated fat intake may be such a strong risk factor could be through its effect on estrogen, as saturated fat has been shown to increase circulating levels of estrogen. Why would we evolve to have such a negative reaction to saturated fat? Why would we evolve to get sick at all? Pregnancy sickness is a universal phenomenon, with nausea and vomiting affecting 70 to 85% of all pregnant women. If you include food aversions in the definition, then the incidence is more like 100%. Because pregnancy sickness is such a common phenomenon, one must question, why is this so? Is there a purpose for such a potentially devastating condition? Well, in the past, pregnancy sickness was dismissed as all just in women's heads, but recent studies have reconsidered pregnancy sickness as an embryo protective mechanism, an evolutionary adaptation to protect the baby. Protect the baby from what? Maybe from meat. Meat is the principal source of pathogens for humans. Meat is also the most common type of food avoided by pregnant women, so the development of an aversion to meat during pregnancy could be protective, as meat may have toxins that are mutagenic, carcinogenic, and teratogenic, meaning birth defect causing. Tainted meat may also be contaminated by pathogens, and pregnancy is a time of relative immunosuppression. Normally we can fend off most meat pathogens. However, by design, pregnant women are immunosuppressed to not reject the developing embryo, since half the baby from the father's side is foreign. So maybe morning sickness evolved as a way to get us to stay away from meat during this vulnerable time. This would be consistent with a profound overrepresentation of taboos against meat eating during pregnancy in sample societies around the world. If this theory is true, then we should be able to make 5 predictions. If nausea and vomiting in pregnancy is there to be protective, then women who have it should have better pregnancy outcomes. And indeed, women who experience nausea and vomiting are significantly less likely to miscarry or suffer a stillbirth. Prediction number 2 would be that the triggering foods contain things that could be particularly harmful to the baby, and indeed, of all food types, animal protein, including meat, poultry, eggs, and seafood, is the most dangerous. Meat is the source of a wide range of pathogens that pose a grave threat to pregnant women and their developing babies. Nausea and vomiting in pregnancy should also coincide with when the embryo is most vulnerable. That's between weeks 5 and 15, when all the critical organ structures are being formed, which is right when nausea and vomiting is peaking, which is right when pregnant women find meats, fish, poultry, and eggs most aversive. And finally, if this theory is true, one would expect a lower frequency of morning sickness among plant-based populations, and yes, the few societies where you don't see such morning sickness problems are the ones that tend to have only plants as dietary staples rather than meat. The number of new chemicals is increasing exponentially. We're talking 12,000 new substances a day. Yet data aren't available on the hazards of even some of the high-volume chemicals. BPA is one of the highest volume chemicals, with billions of pounds produced each year. and studies have raised concerns about its possible implication in the cause of certain chronic diseases, such as diabetes, obesity, reproductive disorders, cardiovascular diseases, birth defects, chronic respiratory and kidney diseases, and breast cancer. A new study on the health implications of BPA comes out nearly every week. BPA was first developed over 100 years ago as a synthetic estrogen, but it wasn't until the 50s that industry realized it could be used to make polycarbonate plastic, and it rapidly became one of the most used chemicals worldwide, even though it was recognized to have hormonal effects. About 1 billion pounds are also used to line food and beverage cans, especially in tuna, apparently, and condensed soups. And now, we basically all have BPA in our bodies and our children's bodies. But not to worry, the government says up to 50 a day is safe, 50 micrograms per kilogram. And even those working in Chinese BPA factories don't get exposed to more than like 70 times lower than that safety limit. OK, then why did exposure seem to affect the male workers' sperm counts? In the US, the general population only gets less than like 1,000 times lower than the safety limit, yet still, we seem to be seeing adverse effects on thyroid function, weight control, blood sugar control, cardiovascular disease, liver function, and immune function, even at those incredibly low doses. So the fact that there are significant adverse effects in populations exposed to BPA at concentrations thousands of times lower than the official tolerable limit indicates that the safe exposure to BPA may be much lower than previously thought in humans, yet the limit hasn't changed. It's been banned from baby bottles and sippy cups, but nearly unlimited doses are still apparently OK for everyone else. What's the disconnect here? It has to do with a fascinating world of low-dose effects of hormone-disrupting chemicals. For decades, these chemicals have been challenging kind of traditional concepts in toxicology, particularly the old adage that it's the dose that makes the poison. The concept that lower exposures to a hazardous compound will therefore always generate lower risks. That's the core assumption underlying our system of chemical safety testing. We start dosing lab animals with a super high amount, and then keep lowering the dose until whatever adverse effects disappear, add a safety buffer, and assume everything below that dose should be OK, assuming, in effect, that the curve looks like this. The higher the dose, the higher the effect. But hormone-disrupting chemicals can have all sorts of curious curves. How could something have more an effect at a lower dose, though? Think about a hormone and its receptors in the body. At low levels of the hormone, like going from 0 to 1, the receptors can fill up quickly, but once they're almost all filled up, going from 4 to 5, adding really high doses may not change things much. Let's use an actual BPA example. This was a study to see if BPA suppressed an obesity-protective hormone in fat samples taken from breast reduction and tummy tuck patients. As you can see, at 100 nanomoles of BPA, I feel like a weatherman here, but at 100 nanomoles of BPA, you can see hormone levels are no lower than they are at 0 BPA. And since most people have levels between 1 and 20, then BPA must be safe. But here's the actual graph. So no suppression at 0, no suppression at 100, but right where levels are in people's bodies, BPA appears to cut hormone release nearly in half. As the world's oldest, largest, and most active organization devoted to research on hormones concluded, even infinitesimally low doses of exposure, indeed any level of exposure at all, may cause problems. Nearly $3 billion worth of problems every year. That's just counting the estimated effects of BPA on childhood obesity and heart disease alone. There are alternatives that the industry could use. The problem, though, is that they may cost 2 cents more. There are thousands of phytochemicals that'll never make it on the side of a cereal box, but may play a role in reducing the risk of chronic diseases. And that's just the ones we know about. We know whole plant foods have consistently been found to be protective, and so it's reasonable for scientists to try to find that magic bullet active ingredient to sell in a pill, but pills simply cannot mimic this balanced, natural combination of phytochemicals present in fruits and vegetables. When isolated out, compounds may lose their activity or behave differently. The antioxidant and anti-cancer activities of plant foods is thought to derive from the additive and synergistic effects, meaning the whole may be greater than the sum of its parts. This helps explain why a pill simply cannot replace the complex combination of phytochemicals present in whole plant foods. As T. Colin Campbell has pointed out, more than 100 trials overwhelmingly show no long-term benefit for vitamin supplements, along with worrisome findings that certain supplements may even increase risk for diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. Supplementation with fish oil appears useless or worse, yet the science doesn't seem to matter. People continue to buy it. The public desire for quick fixes through pills is overwhelming, especially when money can be made. Each plant has thousands of phytochemicals, and each plant has a whole different phytonutrient profile, and so there may be synergistic effects when eating different foods together as well. Just like eating beta-carotene in carrot form is more beneficial than in pill form, because of all the other compounds in the carrot that may synergize with the beta-carotene, when you dip that carrot into hummus, all of a sudden you have the thousands of carrot compounds mixing with the thousands of chickpea compounds. And that's what this study was all about. What happens if you mix different fruits with different vegetables with different beans? Combining foods across different categories did indeed increase the likelihood of synergy. For example, here's the antioxidant power of raspberries alone, and here's the antioxidant power of adzuki beans alone. So if there was strictly an additive effect, the expected combination would come up to here. But the observed antioxidant power of the combination came out more than either eaten alone. What about cancer-fighting effects? What if you repeated the study, but this time tried dripping different combinations of foods onto breast cancer cells growing in a petri dish? Sometimes you get the same synergistic effects. Here's what grapes can do to breast cancer cells, suppressing their growth by about 30%, but onions worked even better, cutting breast cancer growth in half. Now, if you added half of each together, you'd assume you'd get somewhere in the middle, between the two. They'd kind of average each other out, but instead, the researchers got this, suppressing cancer cell growth by up to like 70%. So the whole plus the whole was greater than the sum of the whole parts. So did they recommend people eat a variety of foods, maybe add some raisins along with some chopped red onion to your next salad? Where's the money in that? No. The reason they were investigating the different types of interactions was to identify mixtures that could ultimately lead to the development of something like grape-flavored Funyuns or something. Parkinson's disease is the second most common neurodegenerative disorder after Alzheimer's, characterized by a slowness of movement, rigidity, tremor, and stooping posture that all gets worse and worse. And there's also non-movement symptoms like cognitive impairment, sleep, smell, and mood disturbances, as the disease spreads to other areas of the brain. The cause of Parkinson's is perhaps one of the most important questions posed by the science of aging. For example, why is the consumption of dairy products associated with increased risk for Parkinson's? Maybe because they contribute to our exposure to pesticides and other neurotoxins, like dieldrin, which continues to be found in the autopsied brains of Parkinson's victims, even though it was banned decades ago, but it lingers in the environment, and we continue to be exposed to the pesticide through contaminated dairy and other animal products. It's unlikely to be due to milk compounds such as calcium D, fat, or protein, since there's no association with Parkinson's when they're derived from other sources. It could be the milk sugar, though, lactose, accounting for the increased risk of death and bone fractures, as well as Parkinson's, and earlier onset Huntington's disease. But there's a third possibility as well. Milk lowers uric acid levels, and uric acid may be protective against Huntington's, and also slow the decline of Parkinson's, and most importantly, may lower the risk of getting Parkinson's in the first place, thought to be because uric acid is an important antioxidant in the brain, something we've known for over 30 years now. This can be shown directly in human nerve cells in a petri dish. Add the pesticide rotenone, and oxidative stress shoots up. Add the pro-oxidant homocysteine, and it goes up even more. But add some uric acid, and it completely suppresses the oxidative stress caused by the pesticide. But drinking milk has a uric acid lowering effect, citing this study, describing it as a cute effect of milk. But it turned out to be just a cute typo. An acute effect of milk on uric acid levels in the blood. Drink cow's milk, and uric acid levels drop 10% within hours. Drink soy milk, and they go up 10% within hours. Now, for the painful arthritic disease gout, which is caused by too much uric acid, the uric acid lowering effect of dairy is a good thing. But uric acid is a double-edged sword. If our uric acid levels are too high, we can get gout, but if they're too low, it may increase our risk of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. Here's the 5-year risk of gout in men for various uric acid levels. If our uric acid is over 10, we have a 30% chance of suffering an attack of gout within the next 5 years, whereas at levels under 7, our risk is less than 1%. So it might make sense to have levels as high as possible without going over 7, to protect the brain without risking our joints. But having excessive uric acid in the blood puts more than just our joints in jeopardy. Yes, having too low levels may increase our risk of MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, even cancer, but having too high levels may increase our risk of gout, kidney, and heart disease. So having a uric acid level over 7 isn't just associated with increased risk of gout, but increased risk of dying from all causes. But having a low uric acid level may also shorten our lifespan by increasing mortality. High uric acid is associated with increased risk of death from heart disease, but low uric acid is associated with increased risk of fatal stroke, for example. So keeping uric acid at optimal levels, the sweet spot between 5 and 7, may protect the brain in more ways than one. If you measure the uric acid levels in those with Parkinson's, they come in down around here, which can explain why dairy consumption may increase risk for Parkinson's, because milk pushes uric acid levels down. Dairy may also explain the differences in uric acid levels between meat-eaters, vegetarians, and vegans. If you plot men out, vegans are significantly higher than vegetarians, presumably because they don't drink milk, with those eating meat and milk somewhere in between. I used to think of seaweed as just a beneficial whole food source of minerals like iodine, for which it is the most concentrated dietary source, and indeed, just a half teaspoon of mild seaweeds like aramay, or dulse, or 2 sheets of nori should net you all the iodine you need for the day. But the intake of seaweeds is advised not only as a whole food source of iodine, but also evidently for the prevention of lifestyle-related chronic diseases. Based on what? Well, you'll see this kind of reasoning. The Japanese live long, they eat seaweed, and so they speculate that seaweed might have something to do with it, based on suggestive reports. But when you see lists like this of all the supposed biological activities of some food, you want to know if this is based on clinical data, meaning on actual people, or so-called preclinical data, based on test tubes and lab animals. When a study like this is published, talking about the effects of seaweed-reconstructed pork diets on rats, what do you do with that information? Seaweed is one of the ingredients they're trying to use to improve the image of meat products. So they try to add grape seeds, or flax seeds, or walnuts, or purple rice, or whatever this is. I had to look it up. Thongweed. How's that for an image booster? You can look at epidemiological studies, meaning looking at populations, and indeed Japanese preschoolers who eat seaweed tend to have lower blood pressures, suggesting seaweed might have beneficial effects, which would make sense given all the minerals and fiber, but you can't prove cause and effect with this kind of study. Maybe it was other components of the diet that went along with seaweed eating. It's even harder to do these kind of studies in adults, since so many people are on high blood pressure medications. University of Tokyo researchers took an innovative approach by comparing the diets of people on low dose versus high dose versus multiple blood pressure pills. And although they all had artificially normalized blood pressure, those who ate the most fruit and sea vegetables tended to be the ones on the lower doses, supporting a dietary role for seaweed. But why not just put it to the test? A double-blind crossover trial found that seaweed fiber lowered blood pressure, apparently by pulling sodium out of the system. I know they couldn't use real seaweed, because then you couldn't fool people with a placebo, but why not just use whole powdered seaweed in pills, which was apparently finally attempted 10 years later. Compared to doing nothing, they got beautiful drops in blood pressure. But if you look deeper into the study, they desalinized the seaweed, meaning they took out about 2/3 of the sodium naturally found in, so that still doesn't tell us if just eating seaweed salad is actually going to help with blood pressure. What we need is a randomized controlled trial with just plain straight seaweed, but no one ever done that study until this study out of Ecuador. 6 grams of wakame, natural sodium and all, led to a significant drop in blood pressure, especially in those who started out high. Side effects were all minor, and what one would expect eating increased fiber. And the nice thing about whole food plant-based interventions is that you sometimes get good side effect listings as well, such as the resolution of gastritis, stomach inflammation they'd been having, as well as the disappearance of chronic headaches. Reduction of salt consumption by just 15% could save the lives of millions. If we could cut our salt intake by a half teaspoon a day, which is achievable by avoiding salty foods and not adding salt to our food, might prevent 22% of stroke deaths, and 16% of fatal heart attacks, potentially more than if we're able to successfully treat people with blood pressure pills. An intervention in our kitchens that may be more powerful than interventions in our pharmacies. One little dietary tweak could help more than billions of dollars worth of drugs. What would that mean in the U.S.? Tens of thousands of lives saved every year. This simple step could be as beneficial on a public health scale as interventions aimed at smoking cessation, weight reduction, and giving people blood pressure and cholesterol-lowering medications. And that's not even getting people down to target. Here's the level everyone should get under, exceeded by most Americans over the age of 3. And here's a recommended upper limit of salt intake for African Americans, those with hypertension, and everyone over the age of 40. Processed foods have so much salt added that even if we avoid the saltiest foods and don't add our own salt, that would just get us down to here. But still, that could save up to nearly 100,000 American lives every year. So, given that approximately 75% of dietary salt comes from processed foods, the individual approach is described as impractical. We have to get our food companies to stop killing so many people. And the good news is several manufacturers are reducing the salt content of their foods, but other manufacturers are increasing the salt levels in their products. For example, the addition of salt to poultry, meat, and fish appears to be occurring on a massive scale. The number one source of sodium for kids and teens is pizza. For adults over 51, it's bread. But between the ages of 20 and 50, the greatest contribution of sodium to the diet is not canned soups, pretzels, and potato chips, it's chicken, because of all the salt and other additives that are injected into the meat. This is one of the reasons, in general, animal foods contain higher amounts of sodium than plant foods. Given the sources of sodium, complying with the recommendations for salt reduction will require large deviations from current eating behaviors. We're talking a sharp increase in vegetables, fruit, beans, whole grains, and lower intake of meat and refined grain products. As might be expected, reducing the amount of sodium would necessitate a precipitous drop in meat consumption for men and women of all ages. You can see why there's so much industry pressure to confuse people about sodium. How do vegetarians do? Non-vegetarians get nearly 3,500 milligrams of sodium a day, the equivalent of about a teaspoon and a half of table salt. Now, the U.S. dietary recommendations recommend getting under 2,300 a day, and the American Heart Association says, no way, get under just 1,500 a day. Vegetarians did better, but still double the American Heart Association limit. In Europe, it looks like vegetarians do better, slipping under the 2,300 cutoff, but it appears the only dietary group that nails the American Heart Association recommendation are those eating the most plant-based of diets. When the Women's Health Initiative study found that menopausal women taking hormone replacement therapy suffered higher rates of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and overall harm, a call was made for safer alternatives. Yes, estrogen has positive effects, the Women's Health Initiative found, such as reducing menopausal symptoms and improving bone health, reducing hip fracture risk, but also negative effects, increasing the risk of blood clots in the heart, brain, and lungs, as well as breast cancer. So ideally, to get the best of both worlds, we need what's called a selective estrogen receptor modulator, something that has pro-estrogenic effects in some tissues, like bone, but anti-estrogenic effects in other tissues, like the breast. Drug companies are trying to make them, but phytoestrogens, natural compounds in plants like genistein and soybeans that are structurally similar to estrogen, appear to function as natural selective estrogen receptor modulators. How could something that looks like estrogen act as an anti-estrogen? The original theory for how soy phytoestrogens control breast cancer growth is that they compete with our own estrogens for binding to the estrogen receptor. As you drip more and more soy compounds on breast cancer cells in a petri dish, less and less actual estrogen is able to bind to them. So the estrogen-blocking ability of phytoestrogens can help explain their anti-estrogenic effects. But how do we then explain their pro-estrogenic effects on other tissues like bone? How can soy have it both ways? The mystery was solved when we discovered there are two types of estrogen receptors in the body, and so how a target cell responds depends on which type of estrogen receptors they have. This may be the key to understanding the health protective potential of soy phytoestrogens, the existence of this newly discovered estrogen receptor called estrogen receptor beta, to distinguish it from the classic estrogen receptor alpha. And unlike our body's own estrogen, soy phytoestrogens preferentially bind to the beta receptors. If you have people eat about a cup of cooked whole soybeans, within about 8 hours, genistein levels in the blood reach about 20 to 50 nanomoles. That's how much is circulating throughout our body, bathing our cells. About half is bound up to proteins in the blood, so the effective concentration is about half that. So let's see what that means for estrogen receptor activation. This is the graph that explains the mysterious health benefits of soy foods. Down around the effective levels you'd get eating a cup of soybeans, there's very little alpha activation, but lots of beta activation. So now let's look at where each of these receptors are located in the human body. The way estrogen pills increase the risk of fatal blood clots is by causing the liver to dump out all these extra clotting factors. But guess what? The human liver only contains alpha estrogen receptors, not beta receptors, and so maybe if we ate like 30 cups of soybeans a day, that could be a problem. But at the kinds of concentrations one would get with just normal soy consumption, no wonder this is a problem with drug estrogens, but not soy phytoestrogens. The effects on the uterus appear also to be mediated solely by alpha receptors, which is presumably why no negative impact has been seen with soy. So while estrogen-containing drugs may increase the risk of endometrial cancer up to tenfold, phytoestrogen-containing foods are associated with significantly less endometrial cancer. In fact, protective effects for these types of gynecological cancers in general. Women who ate the most soy had 30% less endometrial cancer, and appeared to cut their ovarian cancer risk nearly in half. Soy phytoestrogens don't appear to have any effect on the lining of the uterus, but still can dramatically improve menopausal symptoms. The Kupperman Index is like a compilation of all 11 of the most common menopausal symptoms. In terms of bone health, human bone cells carry beta estrogen receptors, so we might expect soy phytoestrogens to be protective, and indeed they do seem to significantly increase bone mineral density, consistent with population data suggesting high consumption of soy products is associated with increased bone mass. But can they prevent bone loss over time? Soy milk was compared to a transdermal progesterone cream. The control group lost significant bone mineral density in their spine over the 2-year study period, but the progesterone group lost significantly less, and the 2 glasses of soy milk a day group ended up actually better than when they started. This is probably the most robust study to date, comparing the soy phytoestrogen genistein to a more traditional hormone replacement drug regimen. In the spine, over a year, the placebo group lost bone density, but gained in the phytoestrogen and estrogen groups, and the same with the hip bones. The study clearly shows that the soy phytoestrogen prevents bone loss and enhances new bone formation, in turn producing a net gain of bone mass. But the only reason we care about bone mass is we want to prevent fractures. Is soy food consumption associated with lower fracture risk? Yes, a significantly lower risk of bone fracture associated with just a single serving of soy a day, the equivalent of 5 to 7 grams of soy protein, or 20 to 30 milligrams of phytoestrogens. So that's just like 1 cup of soy milk, or even better, a serving of a whole soy food like tempeh or edamame or the beans themselves. We don't have fracture data on soy supplements, though, so if we seek the types of health benefits we presume Asian populations get from eating whole and traditional soy foods, maybe we should look to eating those rather than taking unproven protein powders or pills. Is there anyone who should avoid soy? Well, some people have soy allergies, but a national survey found that only about 1 in 2,000 people report a soy allergy. That's 40 times less than the most common allergen, dairy milk, and about 10 times less than all the other common allergens like fish, eggs, shellfish, nuts, wheat, or peanuts. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease that typically strikes children and young adults, in which your own immune system attacks and destroys the insulin-producing cells of your pancreas. If untreated, it's deadly, but even with well-managed insulin replacement, it could cut a decade off your life. Families are devastated when a child receives a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. Thus, one of modern medicine's holy grails is to understand what causes the body to attack itself in hopes that we can prevent and cure it. Genetic susceptibility plays an important role, but the concordance for type 1 diabetes is only about 50% among identical twins, meaning even if someone with the same DNA as you gets the disease, it's only about a 50% chance you'll get it too, meaning there must be external factors as well. Some countries have low rates, some have high rates. Japan, for example, has type 1 diabetes rates 18 times lower than the United States. And that's not just genetic, since when children migrate, they tend to acquire the risk of their new home, suggesting it's got to have something to do with the environment, diet, or lifestyle. In fact, the incidence rates vary more than 350-fold around the world. Some countries have hundreds of times higher rates than others, and it's on the rise. Researchers looked at 37 populations from around the world, and the incidence is going up about 3% a year. In fact, I couldn't find a single population going the other direction, 3% higher every year. Our genes don't change that fast. Something is going on. Starting right around World War II, the best evidence available suggests type 1 diabetes showed a stable and relatively low incidence over the first half of the 20th century, followed by a clear increase around the middle of the century. And the question is why? A number of factors have been postulated for tipping children over into diabetes, including vitamin D deficiency, certain infections, or exposure to cow's milk. Decades ago, cross-country comparisons like this were published showing a tight correlation between milk consumption and the incidence of type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent childhood-onset diabetes, showing as much as 94% of the geographic variation in incidence might be explained by differences in milk consumption alone. This country with the highest rates at the top, Finland, led much of the research into this area. It all started with studies like this, showing the less babies are breastfed, the higher the rate of type 1 diabetes, leading to the obvious conclusion: breast milk protects newborn infants. On the other hand, if they're not getting breast milk, they're getting formula, which contain cow's milk proteins. In the first few months of life, the gut is especially leaky to protein, so maybe as our immune system attacks the foreign cow proteins, our pancreas gets caught in the crossfire. But this was based on animal experiments. In susceptible mice, a diet containing the cow's milk protein casein produced diabetes, but it doesn't cause diabetes in rats. So are we more like mice or rats? Researchers drew blood from children with type 1 diabetes to see if they had elevated levels of antibodies that attack bovine proteins compared to controls. And every single one of the affected kids had elevated anti-bovine protein antibodies circulating in their blood, compared to much lower levels in the control subjects. OK, that seems pretty convincing. But what about Iceland? They drink more milk than Finland, yet have less than half the type 1 diabetes. The tight correlation among countries between the incidence of type 1 diabetes among children and cow milk consumption didn't account for Iceland, so you'll see studies like this. Cow's milk consumption in children and adolescents was correlated with the incidence of type 1 diabetes, but only when they excluded the Icelandic data. Is it just genetics? Maybe yes and no. The people of Iceland are genetically similar to other Nordic countries, but their cows are not. Icelandic cattle have been isolated from interbreeding with other cattle breeds for over 1,000 years. See, there are two main types of casein protein, A1 and A2. And Icelandic cattle are unusual in that they produce mostly A2 milk, and that may explain the lower incidence of type 1 diabetes in Iceland. See, A1 casein breaks down into casomorphin, whereas A2 casein does not, and casomorphin has opioid properties which may alter immune function, perhaps increasing susceptibilities to infections that may themselves trigger type 1 diabetes. And that's what you get with Holstein cows, the ones with a classic black and white pattern, which makes up about 95% of the U.S. dairy herd and much of the global dairy herd. It got to a point where dairy boards began taking out patents on methods for selecting non-diabetogenic milk to avoid the triggering of type 1 diabetes. It certainly did restore that tight linear relationship between milk consumption and type 1 diabetes if you just look at the A1 casein consumption. But these so-called ecological or country-by-country studies really only serve to suggest possibilities that then need to be put to the test. So, studies like this were designed where hundreds of siblings of type 1 diabetics were followed for about 10 years, and those that drank a lot of milk had about 5 times the risk of coming down with the disease too. By the mid-90s, more than a dozen such studies were done, and overall, they found that early cow's milk consumption appears to increase the risk of type 1 diabetes by about 50%. That was good enough for the American Academy of Pediatrics, who decided that cow's milk protein may indeed be an important factor in the initiation of the process that destroys your insulin-producing cells, and so the avoidance of cow's milk protein may reduce or delay the onset of type 1 diabetes. Yet another reason to emphasize breast is best. And for those at risk more strongly to avoid the avoidance, they strongly encourage the avoidance of products containing intact cow's milk protein, as opposed to hydrolyzed formula, in which the milk proteins are all broken up into tiny pieces, which is used for kids with dairy allergies, and could potentially make it less risky, but you don't know until you put it to the test. Based on the population studies and meta-analyses of all those antibody studies, which suggested that cow's milk may serve as a trigger of type 1 diabetes, the next year a pilot study was initiated to see if babies at high genetic risk would be less likely to develop antibodies that then attack their own pancreas if they drank casein that was chopped up first. And here's the study. The hydrolyzed formula did seem to reduce the appearance of at least one autoimmune antibody, but not two or more, which is more predictive of the development of the disease. But that was enough for the investigators to embark on the ambitious TRIGGER study, the trial to reduce incidence of diabetes in genetically at risk, a multinational, randomized, prospective trial involving randomizing thousands of newborns across 15 countries, with expected completion in 2017. But in 2010, we got preliminary data suggesting it may have helped, but didn't quite reach statistical significance, meaning basically there was greater than 1 in 20 chance it could have just been a fluke. And indeed, when the first autoimmune antibody results were published, the special hydrolyzed formula didn't seem to help at all. Now, they did just look at a special group of kids at high genetic risk with diabetes running in the family, whereas the great majority of children who get type 1 diabetes actually don't have any afflicted close relatives. But perhaps most importantly, as the researchers themselves emphasize, their study wasn't designed to test whether cow's milk is or is not a trigger for the disease, just what effect the hydrolyzed casein formula might have. Maybe it's not the casein. Maybe it's the bovine insulin. Insulin autoantibodies, antibodies our body produces to attack our own insulin, often appears the first sign in pre-diabetic children. Because cow's milk contains bovine insulin, cow insulin, around the same time the other researchers were looking into casein, this research team was following the development of insulin-binding antibodies in children fed with cow's milk formula. They found significantly more antibodies to bovine insulin in the cow's milk formula group compared to the exclusively breastfed group, who may only be exposed to a few cow proteins through their mom's breast milk if their mom drank the stuff. Furthermore, the bovine antibodies cross-reacted to human insulin, potentially being that caught-in-the-crossfire cause that triggers at least some cases of type 1 diabetes. But you can't know for sure until,
you guessed it, you put it to the test.
Same as the other one, a randomized double-blind trial, but this time they tried a cow's milk formula from which the bovine insulin had been removed, and indeed, without the bovine insulin exposure, the children built up significantly fewer autoimmune antibodies, but what we don't yet know is if this will translate into fewer cases of diabetes. Stay tuned. For many years, the RDA, the recommended daily allowance for vitamins, was just based on preventing deficiency with a margin of safety. But the minuscule amount of vitamin C, for example, needed to avoid scurvy is not necessarily the ideal intake for optimal health. So what might be the optimal intake of vitamin C? Let's ask the body. How might we do that? By seeing how much the body absorbs and excretes. If you swallow 15 milligrams of vitamin C, which is what you'd get eating about 1/4 of an orange, your body sucks up nearly 90% of it. But if you take a supplement containing 1,250 milligrams, your body seems to realize that's too much, and so clamps down on absorption at the intestinal lining level, and you end up absorbing less than half. So by doing experiments where you slowly ratchet up the level of intake, you can see when the body starts to say, OK, that's enough. And that magic level of intake appears to be about 200 milligrams a day. When you take up to 200 milligrams a day, your body sucks it all up, but above that, your body tries to block further absorption, suggesting our intestinal vitamin C transport mechanisms have evolved to fully absorb up to about 200 milligrams of vitamin C a day. In addition, vitamin C is reabsorbed in our kidneys back into our bloodstream to maintain our vitamin C blood levels up at around 70 or 80 micromoles per liter. That's the shaded region there, which is what you reach at vitamin C intakes of about 200 milligrams a day. So even if you take 10 times as much in vitamin C supplements, 2,000 milligrams a day, your body will just pee and poop it out to keep your blood levels in that narrow range. So, based on these kind of data, one might propose that 200 milligrams is the optimal daily intake of vitamin C. You can try to confirm this using disease data. At what daily intake of vitamin C is there the lowest stroke risk? Apparently at about 200 milligrams a day. While dietary vitamin C intake was associated with a lower stroke risk, vitamin C supplements were not, which is consistent with the overall body of evidence showing that antioxidant supplements in general don't seem to protect against heart attacks or strokes. But wait, can you get all the way up to an intake of 200 milligrams a day without taking supplements? No problem. Single servings of fruits and vegetables may have about 50 milligrams each, so a measly 5 servings of fruits and veggies a day could get you up to ideal blood levels. If ginger is so effective against migraines and the pain of menstrual cramps, what about osteoarthritis, an all-too-common disorder that produces chronic pain and disability? The first major study, published in 2000, showed no benefit over placebo, but the study only lasted 3 weeks. The next, in 2001, lasted longer, 6 weeks, and by the end, indeed, was able to show significantly better results than placebo. But the placebo did so well, reducing pain from like 60s on a scale of 1 to 100 down to like 40s, that bringing pain down that extra little bit into the 30s was not especially clinically significant, and so an editorial in the official Journal of the American College of Rheumatology concluded that ginger should not be recommended for treatment of arthritis because of the limited efficacy. But since that time, there's been a few other trials that showed more impressive results, such that ginger is now considered indeed able to reduce pain and disability in osteoarthritis, but how well compared to other treatments? Since osteoarthritis is a chronic disease, it's especially important to weigh the risks and benefits of treatment, and the commonly used anti-inflammatory drugs can carry serious cardiovascular and gastrointestinal risks. For example, if you stick cameras down patients with osteoarthritis on drugs like ibuprofen, nearly half were found to have major injuries to the lining of their small intestine, 7 out of 16. Now, you can reduce that risk by taking an additional drug to counteract the side effects of the first drug. Ibuprofen-type drugs reduce our stomach lining's ability to protect itself from stomach acid, so by blocking stomach acid production with another drug, one can lower the risk. But ginger can actually improve stomach lining protection, so ginger, at the kinds of doses used to treat osteoarthritis, a quarter to a half teaspoon a day, can be considered not just neutral on the stomach, but beneficial. So it can be as pain-relieving as ibuprofen, but without the risk of stomach ulcers. OK, but this sounded nutty to me. Topical ginger treatment, as in externally applying a ginger-soaked cloth or patch to the affected joint. It was a controlled study, compress versus patch, both showing remarkable and lasting pain relief for osteoarthritis sufferers. But what's missing? Right, a control group. There was no placebo patch. And I don't care if ginger's been applied externally to painful joints for thousands of years. The placebo effect has been shown to be remarkably effective in osteoarthritis and providing pain relief, and so until there's a controlled study on topical ginger, I'm not going to believe it. But there wasn't such a study until 20 men stuck ginger slices onto their scrotum. Men with inflamed testicles applied 6 to 10 paper-thin slices of ginger over the affected testes, and evidently the ginger group healed nearly 3 times faster. Unfortunately, the original source is in Chinese, so I can't read for further details, and as is the only other controlled study on topical ginger that I could find. This evidently translates to evaluation of point plaster therapy with ginger powder in preventing nausea and vomiting during chemotherapy. Well, we know ginger powder taken orally can be a miracle against chemo-induced vomiting. What about stuffing it into your belly button? The external application of ginger powder to the so-called point of Schenck, which is the navel, while the control group got potato powder in their belly button. And lo and behold, the ginger group evidently had significantly less nausea and vomiting. Unfortunately, the abstract is the only thing in English, so I can't tell how effectively they blinded the subjects to the treatment. I mean, presumably it would be easy to tell whether you were in the ginger or the placebo group just by the smell. But look, maybe they controlled for that. Until we know more, I would suggest those who want to try ginger use it in their stomach rather than on their stomach. Salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, has been used for thousands of years as an anti-inflammatory painkiller in the form of willow tree bark extract, which Hippocrates used to treat fever and to alleviate pain during childbirth. It became trademarked as a drug in 1899, and remains to this day probably the most commonly used drug in the world. One of the reasons it remains so popular, despite the fact that we have better painkillers now, is that it also acts as a blood thinner. Millions of people now take aspirin on a daily basis to treat or prevent heart disease. It all started back in 1953 with the publication of this landmark study in the New England Journal of Medicine, Length of Life and Cause of Death in Rheumatoid Arthritis. The paper started out with the sentence, "It has often been said that the way to live a long life is to acquire rheumatism." They found fewer deaths than expected, from accidents, which probably could be explained by the fact that people with arthritis probably aren't out, going skiing, but also significantly fewer deaths from heart attacks. Maybe it was all the aspirin they were taking for their joints that was thinning their blood and preventing clots from forming in their coronary arteries. And so in the 1960s, there were calls to study whether aspirin would help those at risk for blood clots. In the 1970s, we got studies suggesting regular aspirin intake protects against heart attacks. Today, the official recommendation is that low-dose aspirin is recommended for all patients with heart disease, but in the general population, for those without a known history of heart disease or stroke, daily aspirin is only recommended when the heart disease benefits outweigh the risk of bleeding. The bleeding complications associated with aspirin use may be considered an underestimated hazard in clinical medical practice. For those who've already had a heart attack, the risk-benefit analysis is clear. If you took 10,000 patients, daily low-dose aspirin use would be expected to prevent approximately 250 major vascular events such as heart attacks, strokes, or, the most major event of all, death. But that same aspirin would be expected to cause approximately 40 major extracranial bleeding events, meaning bleeding so bad you have to be hospitalized. Thus, the net benefit of aspirin for secondary prevention, meaning preventing your second heart attack, would substantially exceed the bleeding hazard. For every 6 major vascular events prevented, only about 1 major bleeding event would occur, so the value of aspirin for secondary prevention is not disputed. But if you instead took 10,000 patients who never had a heart attack or stroke yet, and tried to use aspirin to prevent clots in the first place, so-called primary prevention, daily low-dose aspirin would only be expected to prevent 7 major vascular events at the cost of causing a hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding within the brain, along with 3 other major bleeding events. So, when the benefits are only 2 to 1, it's a little too close for comfort, which is why the new European guidelines do not recommend aspirin for the general population, especially given the additional risk of aspirin causing smaller bleeds within the brain as well. If only there were a safe, simple, side effect-free solution. And there is. Ornish and Esselstyn proved that even advanced, crippling heart disease could not just be prevented and treated, but reversed with a plant-based diet centered around grains, beans, vegetables, fruits, with nuts and seeds treated as condiments, and no oils, dairy, meat, poultry, or fish. Bill Castelli, longtime director of the longest-running epidemiological study in the world, the famous Framingham Heart Study, was once asked what he would do to reverse the coronary artery disease epidemic if he were omnipotent. His answer? Have the public eat the diet prescribed by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. In other words, he told PBS, if Americans ate healthy enough, the whole heart disease epidemic would disappear. Though Esselstyn clarifies, we're not talking just about vegetarianism. This new paradigm of heart disease reversal means exclusively plant-based nutrition. In people without a personal history of cardiovascular disease, the risks of aspirin may outweigh the benefits, but aspirin may have an additional benefit as well. We've long recognized the preventative role of daily aspirin for patients with heart disease. However, it now appears that we can hatch two birds from one egg. Daily low-dose aspirin may help prevent certain forms of cancer as well. In analysis of 8 different studies involving more than 25,000 people, the authors found a 20% decrease in risk of death from cancer among those randomized to a daily aspirin. The search for effective and safe treatments for cancer remains an enormous, burdensome challenge. If only we could just stop cancer in its tracks, or prevent it before it strikes. Well, perhaps we can with this plant phytonutrient, salicylic acid, found in aspirin. How does it affect cancer? Well, the Nobel Prize in Medicine went to the team that discovered how aspirin works. Enzymes called COX, cyclooxygenase, take the pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid, that our body can make, or we can get directly in our diet from mainly chicken and eggs. Our enzymes take this arachidonic acid and turn it into inflammatory mediators like thromboxane, which produces thrombosis, clots, and prostaglandins, which cause inflammation. Aspirin suppresses these enzymes, though, so less thromboxane means fewer clots, and less prostaglandin means less pain, swelling, and fever. But prostaglandins can also dilate the lymphatic vessels inside tumors, allowing cancer cells to spread. So one of the ways cancer tries to kill us is by boosting COX activity. That's one of the ways we think aspirin can help prevent cancer, by counteracting tumor attempts to pry open the lymphatic bars on its cage and spread throughout the body. Because the reduction in mortality due to cancers occurred within 2 to 3 years after aspirin was started, that seems too quick to be accounted for by an effect only on the genesis or formation of cancer. Cancer can take decades to develop. So the only way aspirin could save us that fast is by suppressing the growth and spread of tumors that already exist. Aspirin appeared to cut the risk of metastases in half, particularly for adenocarcinomas like colon cancer. So now what about everyone taking a daily baby aspirin? Previous risk-benefit analysis does not consider the effects of aspirin on cancer, instead just balancing cardiovascular benefits with bleeding risks, but these new cancer findings may change things. If it was just the reduction of colon cancer risk, then the benefits might not outweigh harms for the general public, but now we have evidence that it may work against other cancers too. Even a 10% reduction in overall cancer incidence could tip the balance of benefits versus risks. How does the cancer benefit compare? Well, as we saw before, using aspirin in healthy people just for cardiovascular protection is kind of a wash. By contrast, the cancer prevention rates might save twice as many lives, so the benefits may outweigh the risks. If you put it all together, heart attack, strokes, cancer, and bleeding, aspirin comes out looking protective overall, potentially extending our lifespan. Yes, higher risk of major bleeding, even on low-dose aspirin, but fewer heart attacks, clotting, strokes, and cancers, so may be beneficial overall. Now note these age categories only go up to 74 years old, though. That's because the risk of bleeding on aspirin increases steeply with age, and so may tip the balance the other way. But in younger folks, this data certainly has the research community buzzing. The emerging evidence on aspirin's cancer protection highlights an exciting time for cancer prevention. In light of low-dose aspirin's ability to reduce mortality from both vascular events and cancer to a very notable degree, it's tempting to recommend low-dose aspirin for nearly everyone. However, aspirin pills, even in low doses, has a propensity to damage the lining of our stomach and intestines, and increase risk of gastrointestinal bleeding. This fact may constrain health authorities from recommending aspirin for the general population. Recent meta-analyses estimate that just a single year of low-dose aspirin therapy will induce major gastrointestinal bleeding in 1 out of 833 people. If only there were a way to get the benefits without the risks. Those who remember this video already know the answer. The aspirin phytonutrient isn't just found in willow trees, but throughout the plant kingdom. This explains why the active ingredient in aspirin is found normally in the bloodstream, even in people not taking aspirin. Here's the levels of aspirin in people that eat fruits and vegetables. And here's the level in people that typically do not. Right? Then drink just a single fruit smoothie, and within an hour and a half, your levels rise. But as you can see, one smoothie ain't going to do it. You have to have regular daily fruit and vegetable consumption. Are these kinds of aspirin levels sufficient, though, to suppress the expression of the inflammatory enzyme implicated in cancer growth and spread? Using umbilical cords and foreskins, where else are you going to get human tissue from, they found that even those low levels caused by smoothie consumption significantly suppressed the expression of this inflammatory enzyme at a genetic level. Well, if this aspirin phytonutrient is made by plants, we might expect plant eaters to have higher levels. And indeed, not only did they find higher levels in vegetarians, there was an overlap with people taking aspirin pills. Some vegetarians had the same level in their blood as people actually taking aspirin. Vegetarians pee out as much of the active metabolite of aspirin as aspirin users do, just because they may be eating so many fruits and vegetables. Because the anti-inflammatory action of aspirin is probably the result of the active ingredient in aspirin, salicylic acid, and the concentrations of salicylic acid seen in vegetarians have been shown to inhibit that inflammatory COX enzyme in vitro, it's plausible that dietary salicylates may contribute to the beneficial effects of a vegetarian diet, although it seems unlikely that most omnivores would be able to achieve sufficient dietary intake of salicylates to have a therapeutic effect, though look, they could eat lots of fruits and veggies too. With effectively all that aspirin flowing through their systems, plant eaters must have higher ulcer rates, right? Aspirin can chew away your gut. But no, vegetarians appear to have a significantly lower risk of ulcers for both women and men. So for the general population, by eating plants instead of taking aspirin, we may not only get the benefits without the risks, we can get benefits with benefits. How is that possible? Because in plants, the salicylic acid may come naturally pre-packaged with gut-protective nutrients. For example, nitric oxide from dietary nitrates exerts stomach protective effects by boosting blood flow and the protective mucus production in the lining of the stomach, effects which demonstrably oppose the pro-ulcerative impact of aspirin. Dark green leafy vegetables are among the richest dietary source of nitrates, but of course, the researcher goes on to say, since it may be unrealistic to expect people to eat ample servings of greens every day, we should just give people pills with their pills, right? Nitrate pills with their aspirin pills. But I say we should just eat our greens. People who've had a heart attack should follow their physician's advice, which probably includes taking a daily aspirin. But what about everyone else? I think everyone should be on aspirin, but in produce, not pill form. I was going to use kale. I wanted to whip out kale. I got the green screen, and you can't. Anyway. The results of the recent aspirin meta-analysis suggesting a reduction of cancer mortality by about a third in subjects taking daily low-dose aspirin can justly be called astounding. Yet the protection from Western cancers enjoyed by those eating more traditional plant-centered diets is even more dramatic. Before the Westernization of their diets, animal products made up only about 5% or less of the Japanese diet. And here's their cancer rates compared to the United States at the time. Note that age-adjusted death rates from cancers of the colon, prostate, breast, and ovary were on the order of 5 to 10 times lower in Japan than in the US, with mortality from pancreatic cancer, leukemias, and lymphomas 3 to 4-fold lower. But this phenomenon was by no means isolated to Japan. Western cancers were likewise comparatively rare in other societies where people ate plant-based diets. The cancer protection afforded by lifelong consumption of a plant-based diet, in conjunction with the leanness and insulin sensitivity that tends to come along with it, may be very substantial indeed. Therefore, a lifestyle protocol for minimizing cancer risk may include a whole food, plant-based diet. Now, if part of this cancer protection arises out of the aspirin phytonutrients in plants, are there any plants in particular that are packed with salicylates? Though salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin, is ubiquitously present in fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices contain the highest concentrations. Chili powder, paprika, turmeric have a lot, but cumin is like 1% aspirin by weight. Eating a teaspoon of cumin is like taking a baby aspirin. Consequently, populations that incorporate substantial amounts of spices in foods may have markedly higher daily intakes of salicylates. Indeed, it's been suggested that the low incidence of colorectal cancer among Indian populations may be ascribed in part to high exposure to dietary salicylates throughout life from spice consumption. The population in rural India has one of the lowest rates of colorectal cancer in the world. They have a diet that could be extremely rich in salicylic acid, given the substantial amounts of plant foods flavored with large quantities of herbs and spices. Some have proposed it's the curcumin in the spice turmeric, but maybe it's the salicylic acid in cumin, and the spicier the better. A spicy veggie vindaloo may have 4 times the salicylates of a mild Madras-style veggie dish. One meal, and you get a spike in your bloodstream like you just took an aspirin. So eating flavor-filled vegetarian meals with herbs and spices may be more chemoprotective, meaning more protective against cancer than just regular, more bland vegetarian meals. We may also want to eat organic. Because salicylic acid is a defense hormone of plants, the concentration is increased when plants become stressed, like when plants are bitten by bugs, unlike pesticide-laden plants. And indeed, soups made from organic vegetables were found to have nearly 6 times more salicylic acid than soups prepared from conventionally grown ingredients. We should also choose whole foods. Whole grains breads, which are high in salicylic acid, contain about 100 times more phytochemicals than white bread, 800 perhaps compared to 8. That does raise the question, though, what about the other 799? Interest in the potential beneficial effects of dietary salicylates has risen in part because of the extensive literature on the disease-preventative effects of aspirin. However, it should not be forgotten that plant products found to contain salicylic acid are generally rich sources of a whole long list of other phytonutrients, many of which have marked anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity as well. Their potential protective effects should therefore not be overlooked. In this context, the importance of dietary salicylic acid should not perhaps be overemphasized. Indeed, some believe that salicylic acid deficiency has such important public health implications that it should be classed as an essential vitamin, namely vitamin S. But what they're really saying is that we should all just have to eat a lot of plants. Metabolomics is a term used to describe the measurement of multiple metabolites in biological specimens, like bodily fluids, with the goal of identifying molecular signatures. For example, if you compared the metabolic profile of those with severe heart disease to those with clean arteries, maybe we could come up with a cheap, simple, non-invasive way to screen people. If heart patients happen to have something in their blood that healthy people didn't, we could test for that. And maybe it would even help us understand the mechanisms of disease. To refer to metabolomics as a new field, though, is to do injustice to ancient doctors who used ants to diagnose people with diabetes, because the ants could detect the sugar in their urine. The first modern foray discovered hundreds of substances in a single breath, for example, thanks to the development of computer technology that made it possible to handle large amounts of information. And that was in 1971, a time when computers looked like this. New technologies have allowed researchers to measure hundreds or even thousands of metabolites at a time, which is good, since more than 25,000 compounds may be entering our body through our diet alone. The data comes out looking like this, which computers can turn into maps that allow researchers to try to piece together connections. Metabolomics is where the story of TMAO started. Everyone knows that a bad diet can lead to heart disease, but which dietary components are the most harmful? So researchers at the Cleveland Clinic screened blood from patients who had experienced a heart attack or stroke, and compared the results with those from blood of people who had not. Using all sorts of fancy technology, they identified a compound called TMAO, which stands for trimethylamine oxide. The more of this TMAO stuff people had in their blood, the greater the odds they had heart disease, and the worse their heart disease was. Where does this TMAO stuff come from? Our liver turns TMA into TMAO. OK, where does TMA come from? Certain bacteria in our gut turn something in our diet called choline into TMA. Where is the highest concentration of choline found? Eggs, milk, and meats, including poultry and fish. So when we eat these foods, our gut bacteria may make TMA, which is absorbed into our system and oxidized by our liver into TMAO, which may then increase our risk of heart attack, stroke, and death. But just because at a snapshot in time people with heart disease tend to have higher TMAO levels, doesn't mean having high TMAO necessarily leads to bad outcomes. We'd really want to follow people over time, which is what they did next. 4,000 people followed for 3 years, and those with the highest TMAO levels went on to have significantly more heart attacks, stroke, or death. Wait a second, though. If high TMAO levels come from eating lots of meat, dairy, and eggs, then maybe the only reason people with high TMAO levels have lots of heart attacks is they're eating lots of meat, dairy, and eggs. Maybe having high TMAO levels is just a marker of a diet high in red meat, eggs, milk, and chicken that's killing people by raising cholesterol levels or something, and has nothing to do with TMAO at all. Conversely, the reason a low TMAO level seems so protective may just because it's indicative of a more plant-based diet. One of the reasons we think TMAO is directly responsible is that TMAO levels predict the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death independently of other traditional cardiovascular risk factors, meaning whether or not you have high cholesterol or low cholesterol, high blood pressure or low blood pressure, having high TMAO levels appear to be bad news. This has since been replicated in other studies, up to 9 times the odds of heart disease at high TMAO blood levels, even after controlling for meat, fish, and cholesterol intake, which is a surrogate for egg intake. But what about the rest of this sequence? How can we be certain that our gut bacteria can take the choline we eat and turn it into trimethylamine in the first place? Easily. They just have to administer a simple dietary choline challenge. How do you do that? Just give them some eggs. Have people eat 2 hard-boiled eggs, and you get a bump of TMAO in their blood within an hour of consumption. But what if you gave them antibiotics to wipe out their gut flora? Then you can give them eggs and nothing happens. In fact, their TMAO levels are down at 0, showing gut bacteria plays a critical role. But if you wait a month, give their gut some time to recover from the antibiotics, TMAO levels come creeping back up. These findings did not thrill the egg industry. Imagine you work for the American Egg Board, tasked with designing a study to show no effect of eating nearly an egg a day. How could you rig it to show no difference? Well, if you look at the effect of an egg meal, you get a bump in TMAO levels, but your kidneys are so good at getting rid of this nasty stuff that by hours 4, 6, 8, you're back to baseline. So all you have to do is just make sure they hadn't eaten those eggs in the last 12 hours, and you can show no effect and get your study published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and collect your paycheck. The problem with publishing research on chocolate is that the press jumps on it, oversimplifying and sensationalizing the message. Then the money starts rolling in from candy companies, muddying the message. But lost in all this is an important idea that the flavanol phytonutrients in cocoa do appear to be beneficial. The sugar in chocolate isn't good for us, the fat and excess calories in chocolate aren't good for us, but natural cocoa powder can be considered a health food. So adding cocoa to a smoothie or oatmeal or whatever would be health promoting. But ideally, choose unprocessed, undutched cocoa, since the flavonols are what give cocoa its bitterness, so they try to process the cocoa with alkali to destroy them on purpose. Thus, when it comes to cocoa, bitter appears to be better. In my video on chocolate and artery function, I showed how dark chocolate could improve the function of coronary arteries in the heart within 2 hours of consumption using fancy angiography, but there are some blood vessels you can visualize with your eyes. The blood vessels in your eyes 2 hours after eating dark chocolate, significant improvement in the ability of the little veins on the back of your eyes to dilate. What about the blood vessels in your legs? Peripheral artery disease, atherosclerosis in the arteries feeding your limbs, leading to claudication, a crampy pain in your calf muscles when you try to exercise due to impaired blood flow. So, maximal walking distance and maximal walking time were studied in 20 peripheral artery disease patients 2 hours after eating dark chocolate with a respectable 85+% cocoa, or after eating wimpy milk chocolate. And after the dark chocolate, they could walk about a dozen more yards and about 17 more seconds than before the dark chocolate, but after the milk chocolate, they weren't even able to walk as far as baseline and not a single second more. So there does seem to be something in cocoa that's helping, but look, a few seconds here or there aren't going to cut it. How about reversing the atherosclerosis, which we didn't even think was possible until 1977? Wait a second, what happened in 1977? Dean Ornish didn't start publishing on heart disease reversal until 1979. Well, the first demonstration of atherosclerosis reversal with a cholesterol-lowering diet and drugs wasn't on coronary arteries going to the heart, but actually these femoral arteries going to the legs. What about arteries going to the brain? There's a non-invasive way to measure artery function within the brain using transcranial ultrasound. If you ask someone to hold their breath, the brain says, uh-oh, and starts opening up the arteries to increase blood flow to compensate. But if the arteries in our brain are stiffened and crippled by atherosclerosis, they're unable to open as much and as fast as they should, and so are said to have a smaller breath-holding index, which can be a risk factor for stroke. So researchers designed an experiment in which they compared the results of a target food to something neutral, like oatmeal. So did they choose like a spoonful of cocoa powder or something? No. A randomized crossover trial of oatmeal versus a deep-fried Mars bar. Wait, why a deep-fried Mars bar? Well, this was published in the Scottish Medical Journal, and evidently deep-fried Mars bars are snacks strongly associated with Scotland. Wait, is that just an urban legend or something? No, 627 fish and chip shops in Scotland were called to ascertain the delicacy's availability, and more than 1 in 5 said yes, selling up to 200 a week. Just follow the signs. Comes out looking a little something like this. Batter dipped in deep-fried Snickers and pizza were evidently less popular. The researchers conclude that it's not just an urban myth. Encouragingly, they did find some evidence of the penetrance of the Mediterranean diet, albeit in the form of deep-fried pizza. Could this be contributing to Scotland having among the highest stroke rate in Europe? Well, they put it to the test, and interestingly, there was a significant drop in men compared to women. Maybe men are from Mars, women are from Snickers? Regardless, what about chocolate that's not deep-fried? There's been a few population studies that followed people over time that found that those who ate chocolate appeared to have lower stroke rates, since confirmed by another study, but maybe chocolate consumption just happens to be related to other behaviors that are heart and brain healthy. Like, hey, people that exercise a lot also eat more food, period, so maybe they eat more chocolate? They didn't find any evidence of that, but you can't account for everything. To prove cause and effect, you'd have to randomize people into two groups, make half eat chocolate and the other half not, and follow them out for a decade or two, to which one researcher replied, "Fat chance. You try to get people into a study where they could be randomized to 16 years without chocolate." Recommendations to limit sugar consumption vary around the globe, with guidelines ranging from limit sweet desserts to one every other day to keep sugar consumption to 4 or less occasions per day. In the U.S., the American Heart Association is leading the charge, proposing dramatic reductions in the consumption of soft drinks and other sweetened products. They recommend sticking to under about 5% of calories a day from added sugars, which may not even allow for a single can of soda. Why the American Heart Association? Because the overconsumption of added sugars has long been associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, meaning heart disease and strokes. We used to think that added sugars was just a marker for an unhealthy diet. At fast food restaurants, people are probably more likely to order a cheeseburger with their supersized soda than a salad. But the new thinking is that no, the added sugars in processed foods and drinks may be an independent risk factor in and of itself, worse than just empty calories, but actively disease-promoting calories based on data like this. This is how much sugar the American public is eating. Only about 1% meet the American Heart Association recommendation to push added sugar consumption down to 5 or 6% of daily caloric intake. Most people are up around 15%. And that's up where cardiovascular disease risk starts to take off, with a doubling of risk at about 25% of calories, and a quadrupling of risk for those getting a third of their daily caloric intake from added sugars. We went from eating 7 pounds of sugar a year 200 years ago to 50 pounds to now over 100 pounds. We're hardwired to like sweet foods because we evolved surrounded by fruit, not Fruit Loops. But this adaptation is terribly misused and abused today, hijacked by the food industry for our pleasure and their profits. Why are we consuming so much sugar despite knowing too much can harm us? Yes, it may have an addictive quality. Yes, there's that hardwiring, but the processed food industry isn't helping. 75% of packaged foods in the United States contain added sweeteners, mostly coming from sugar-sweetened beverages like soda, thought responsible for more than 100,000 deaths worldwide, millions of years of healthy life lost. No problem, why not just switch to diet? By choosing diet soda, can we get that sweet taste we crave without the downsides? Unfortunately, routine consumption of diet soft drinks is linked to increases in the same risks that many seek to avoid by using artificial sweeteners. Here's what studies have found for the increased risk of cardiovascular disease associated with regular soda. And here's the cardiovascular risk associated with diet soda. In other words, the belief that switching to diet soda will reduce long-term health risks is not well supported by scientific evidence, and instead may contribute to the very health risks people are seeking to avoid. But why? It makes sense why drinking all that sugar might increase stroke risk with the extra inflammation and triglycerides, but why in this pair of Harvard studies, did a can of diet soda appear to increase stroke risk the same amount. Yes, maybe the caramel coloring in brown sodas like colas may play a role, but another possibility is that artificial sweeteners may increase the desire for sugar-sweetened, energy-dense beverages and foods. See, the problem with artificial sweeteners is that a disconnect ultimately develops between the amount of sweetness the brain tastes and how much blood sugar ends up coming to the brain. The brain feels cheated and figures you have to eat more and more and more sweetness in order to get any calories out of it. As a consequence, at the end of the day, your brain says, OK, at some point I need some blood sugar here, and then you eat an entire cake, because no one can hold out in the end. If you give people Sprite Zero, or unsweetened carbonated lemon-lime water, and you don't tell them what it is or what the study's about, and later on offer them a choice between M&Ms, spring water, or sugar-free gum, guess who picks the M&Ms? Those that drank the artificially sweetened soda were nearly 3 times more likely to take the candy than either those that consumed the sugar-sweetened or unsweetened drinks. So it wasn't a matter of sweet versus non-sweet, and it wasn't a matter of calories versus no calories. There's something about non-caloric sweeteners that somehow tricks the brain. Then they did another study in which everyone was given Oreos, and they asked people how satisfied the cookies made them feel. And again, those that drank the Sprite Zero reported feeling less satisfied than either the normal Sprite or the sparkling water. These results are consistent with recent brain imaging studies demonstrating that regular consumption of artificial sweeteners can alter the neural pathways responsible for the pleasure response to food. The only way to really prevent this problem, to break the addiction, is to go completely cold turkey, go off all sweeteners, artificial as well as table sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and eventually the brain resets itself, and you don't crave it as much. We've always assumed the consumption of both sugar and artificial sweeteners may be changing our palates or taste preferences over time, increasing our desire for sweet foods. Unfortunately, the data on this are lacking
until now.
20 folks agreed to cut out all sugars and artificial sweeteners for 2 weeks, and afterwards 95% found that sweet foods or drink tasted sweeter or too sweet, and said moving forward that they would use less or even no sugar. And most stopped craving sugar within the first week, 6 days. This suggests a 2-week sugar challenge, or even a 1 week, may help to reset taste preferences and make consuming less or no sugar easier. And so maybe we should be recommending it to our patients. Eating fewer processed foods and choosing more real, whole, and plant-based foods make it easy to consume less sugar. Prostate cancer is a leading cause of illness and death among men in the Western world, but the prostate cancer rates in Asia can be as much as 10 times lower. Maybe genetically they're just that much less likely to get it? No. Japanese and Chinese Americans have high prostate cancer rates as well. In the U.S., up to nearly 1 in 3 men in their 30s already have small prostate cancers brewing, and that grows to nearly 2/3 of American men by their 60s. On autopsy, most older men were found to have unknown cancerous tumors in their prostates. What's remarkable is that Asian men seem to have the same prevalence of these hidden, latent prostate cancers on autopsy, but the tumors don't tend to grow enough to cause problems. In Japan, men die with their tumors rather than from their tumors. Of course, that's changing as Asian populations continue to westernize their diets. What is it about Western diets that's fueling cancer growth? Well, it could be carcinogens in the diet accelerating the growth of cancer. The typical U.S. diet is rich in animal fats and meats, but it could also be something protective in Asian diets that's slowing the cancer growth, like fruits and vegetables, soy foods, or green tea. How might one figure out if there's a link between tea consumption and the risk and progression of prostate cancer? Well, you can see if tea drinkers tend to get less cancer in the future, and if cancer victims tended to have drank less tea in the past. Dozens of studies have done just that, and although the results were mixed, overall tea consumption was associated with a lower risk of prostate cancer. And so tea consumption might indeed play a protective role, but just because tea drinkers get less cancer doesn't mean it's necessarily the tea. Maybe tea drinking is just a sign of a more traditional lifestyle. Maybe tea drinkers are less likely to be patrons of the 1,000 KFC outlets now in Japan, for example. To control for as many factors as possible, you could perform in vitro studies in a lab where you take everything else out of the equation except green tea and prostate cancer by dripping green tea compounds directly onto prostate cancer cells in a petri dish, which can cause them to self-destruct. But are enough green tea compounds absorbed into our bloodstream when we drink it? Looks like it takes about a concentration of 40 picomoles per milliliter to cut the viability of human prostate cancer cells more than half in a petri dish. How much green tea would men have to drink to get concentrations that high in their prostate glands? Well, if you have men drink 6 cups of green tea a day before undergoing prostate removal surgery, they can indeed build up that 40 picomole cancer-stopping concentration in their prostate tissue. That may explain why some studies failed to find an association between tea drinking and cancer. In the US, for example, the high tea drinking group may be defined as more than 5 cups of tea a week, which didn't seem to do much. But in Japan, the high tea drinking group can be 5 more cups a day, which appeared to cut the risk of aggressive prostate cancer about in half. Not apparently by preventing the formation of the cancer in the first place, but perhaps by slowing or stopping the cancer's growth. Well, if green tea can stop the growth of prostate cancer, why not try giving green tea to prostate cancer patients to see if it'll help? Green tea has been called nature's defense against cancer. Population studies linking green tea consumption with lower cancer risk has led some to advocate for the incorporation of green tea into the diet. After all, what's the downside? However, population studies can't prove cause and effect. It's not possible to determine whether green tea actually prevents cancer in people until you
Put it to the test.
Prostate cancer is preceded by a precancerous condition known as intraepithelial neoplasia. Within 1 year, about 30% of such lesions turns into cancer. Because no treatment is given to patients till cancer is officially diagnosed, what a perfect opportunity to give green tea a try. So, 60 men with precancerous prostate intraepithelial neoplasia were randomized into either a green tea group or a placebo group. It's hard to make a convincing placebo tea, so they used green tea pills, roughly equivalent to about 6 cups of green tea a day, compared to sugar pills. 6 months into the study, they took biopsies from everyone, and in the placebo group, 6 out of the 30 developed cancer by the halfway point, and then 3 of the remaining 24 by the end of the year. So 9 out of 30 in the placebo group developed cancer, or 30%, which is what normally happens when you don't do anything. About 30% go on to develop cancer within the first year. But in the green tea group, none developed cancer within the first 6 months, and only 1 by the end of the year, so only 1 out of 30, nearly 10 times less than the placebo group. The first demonstration that green tea compounds could be very effective for treating premalignant lesions before prostate cancer develops. And even a year later, after they stopped the green tea, nearly 90% of the original green tea group remained cancer-free, while more than half of the placebo group developed cancer. This suggests that the benefits of the green tea may be long-lasting. Overall, a nearly 80% reduction in prostate cancer.
That is pretty impressive.
What if you already have prostate cancer, though? A proprietary green tea extract supplement was given to 26 men with confirmed prostate cancer for an average of about a month before they had their prostates removed. And there was a significant reduction in a number of cancer biomarkers, such as PSA levels, suggesting a shrinkage of the tumor. But there was no control group, and the study was funded by the supplement company itself. When an independent group of researchers tried to replicate the results in a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, they failed to find any statistically significant improvement. So maybe green tea is only effective in the precancerous state, but not powerful enough to impact overt prostate cancer? Certainly didn't seem to help advanced metastatic cancer in the 2 studies that tried it. And recently, doubt has been cast on the precancerous results. When researchers tried to replicate it, the green tea extract group only seemed to cut prostate cancer development about in half, which, because of the small number of people in the study, may very well have happened just by chance. So where does that leave us? Unfortunately, green tea extract pills are not without risk. There's been about a dozen case reports of liver damage associated with their use, and so until there's more solid evidence of benefit, I'd stick with just drinking the tea. OK, green or black? A recent study randomized about 100 men with prostate cancer to consume 6 cups a day of green or black tea, found a significant drop in PSA levels and NF-kappa beta in the green tea group, but not the black tea or control groups. NF-kappa beta is thought to be a prognostic marker for prostate cancer progression, and so the green tea appeared to work better than the black. The incidence of cancers has been rising for the last half-century, and the question is why? Well, up to 20% of all cancers are caused by infectious agents, chiefly viruses, something we've known was a possibility for a century, when a cancer-causing virus was discovered in chickens. It was such heresy that Dr. Rouse wouldn't get his Nobel Prize for this landmark discovery until 55 years later. If there are cancer-causing chicken viruses, what about people who handle or eat poultry? Concern has been raised about the potential infectivity of cancer-causing farm animal viruses for decades. The first question was whether there was any evidence of human exposure, and indeed, people do have antibodies to these cancer-causing chicken viruses in their bloodstream, indicating that the virus is no stranger to our immune systems. OK, but is there any evidence that the virus itself can get into our blood? There wasn't until 2001. There's a cancer-causing herpes virus in poultry. The question is, does it pose a public health hazard? Researchers used DNA fingerprinting techniques to test the blood of about 200 people, and 20% had the viral DNA in their bloodstream, 1 in 5. OK, but that still doesn't mean these viruses necessarily can infect human cells, but indeed they can. OK, but do they cause human disease? How are we going to figure that out? Obviously can't just inject people. So researchers looked at poultry workers. That's how we figured out how other farm animal diseases jump to humans, not to mention the discovery of the carcinogenic nature of things like asbestos and benzene. You study the workers who are exposed day in, day out. If they don't have higher cancer rates, then presumably the viruses are harmless, but unfortunately they do. Those at high exposure to poultry cancer-causing viruses do have increased risk of dying from several cancers, so the relative ease by which some of the viruses can infect human cells, and to infect and cause tumors in primates and laboratories, may be of public health significance, particularly given the increased risk of cancer among meat workers, and the evidence that we may indeed become infected. Even if poultry workers are at risk, though, that doesn't mean people who just eat chicken or eggs are. Just because those who kill chickens may be 6 times more likely to die from brain cancer, for example, they've got live birds flapping in their face. The intensity of exposure to these viruses in the general population, presumably nowhere near that experienced by poultry workers, though the general population is nevertheless widely exposed to them just because we do eat so much chicken and eggs. This is supported by data showing that it's not only the factory farm workers that are at higher risk for brain tumors, but also just butchers or meat cutters who have no exposure to live birds. especially those who don't wear gloves, apparently, or who frequently have cuts on their hands, and for other cancers as well. Those who handle meat for a living also have higher rates of non-cancer mortality, like increased deaths from heart disease. Could the viruses be involved there too? Some of the poultry viruses don't just cause cancer in chickens, but also atherosclerosis. That cancer-causing herpes virus also triggers the buildup of cholesterol crystals. OK, but that's in chickens. What about in people? Because chickens infected with Merrick disease virus develop atherosclerotic lesions after infections, researchers looked for the presence of any herpes virus in human artery wall tissue and found it, though any role viruses play in human heart disease remains speculative. But here we were all along, thinking that the substances present in animal foods increasing risk of diseases like cancer, heart disease, was like heme iron, saturated fat, cholesterol, dioxins, cooked meat carcinogens. But we didn't think about the viruses, which is important not only for supermarket workers, but also because the general population is exposed as well. Indeed, that study that found the chicken cancer virus DNA circulating in people's bloodstream found about the same rates in office workers as they did in chicken slaughterhouse workers. Increasing the cost of cigarettes through tobacco taxes is one of the most effective ways to decrease the harms of smoking. Increasing the cost of cigarettes by just 10% could prevent millions of tobacco-related deaths. So what about taxing unhealthy food? In general, public health decision-makers have had three main options: inform consumers with labeling, nudge people with incentives, or more heavy-handed approaches, such as instituting regulations or taxes. These policy approaches have proven crucial in reducing tobacco use, alcohol abuse, and deaths from car crashes. For example, driver education alone, or by labeling cars with information about crash risk, didn't help as much as making sure they installed airbags. Given that heart disease alone kills 10 times more people than injuries on the road, maybe the current epidemic of nutrition-related disease requires a similar multifaceted approach. Even modest dietary improvements could significantly reduce the burden of chronic disease. So maybe a national system of subsidies for good foods and taxes for bad could facilitate more sensible dietary choices. But would they work? A systematic review of the available evidence suggests that they do. Decreasing the consumption of unhealthy foods, the more you tax, the lower consumption drops, and increasing the consumption of healthy foods, the more you subsidize foods like fruits and vegetables, the cheaper you make them, the more may be eaten. A small price difference succeeded in decreasing our exposure to lead. What about a tax to decrease our exposure to saturated fat? Such a tax could potentially save thousands of lives. But wait a second, wouldn't such a tax disproportionately affect the poor? Yes, they would benefit the most. It's like cigarette taxes. The poor stand to benefit the most. That's the classic tobacco industry argument. Cigarette taxes are unfair and regressive, burdening the poor the most, to which the public health community responded, cancer is unfair. Cancer disproportionately burdens the poor, so taxes would affect the greatest health gains for the least well-off. The so-called Committee Against Unfair Taxes was just a front, organized and funded by the tobacco industry, a common tactic used by the industry to hide its role in fighting tobacco taxes beyond just trying to overtly buy politicians off. The fact that the industry fought tooth and nail suggests that tobacco taxes can indeed affect consumption. But much of the data on food taxes and subsidies have been based on models, or stated preferences to hypothetical scenarios, with people just saying they'd change consumption patterns based on price. There hasn't been as much real-world data. You can put people through fancy 3D supermarket simulators and find a 25% discount on fruits and veggies appears to boost fruit and veggie purchases by 25%, nearly 2 pounds a week. But virtual vegetables don't do you any good. Does this work out in the real world? Yes. South Africa's largest health insurance company started offering 10 or 25% cash back on healthy food purchases to hundreds of thousands of households, up to $500 a month. Why would they do that? Why would they give money away? Because it works. Apparently increasing the consumption of fruits and vegetables and whole grains while decreasing the consumption of foods high in added sugar, salt, and fat, including processed meats and fast food. Subsidies are more popular than taxes, though. In Europe, a number of countries have instituted taxes on sugary foods or salty foods, but Denmark was the first to introduce a tax on saturated fat, like meat and dairy. But it only took the food industry about a year to squash it, demonstrating that public health advocates are weak in tackling the issues of corporate power. An enormous imbalance between the influence exerted by public health professionals compared to the political might of the food industry. Bringing to mind the fight over traffic light labeling on food, that's way too easy to understand, so the industry went nuts and spent more than $1 billion killing the proposal in favor of the bring your calculator to the grocery store guideline daily amount labeling to make it as confusing as possible. Denmark ended up canceling the fat tax and shelving their sugar tax, because the farming and food company interests claimed too many jobs would be lost if people ate healthier. Apparently, a healthy economy was more important than a healthy population. Ironically, it was abolished just when evidence of the effects started to appear. The introduction of the saturated fat tax did end up contributing to reducing the intake of saturated fat among Danish consumers from some meat and dairy products, but not from sour cream. Why? Well, the public ended up eating so much more low-fat sour cream that it ended up outweighing the smaller reduction in high-fat sour cream. So you always have to think about the unintended consequences. If people swap out sugary cookies for salty chips, for example, it might not be doing the public's health many favors. One field study of a tax on soda found that you can drop soft drink purchases, at least in the short term, but households may just end up buying more beer. Asthma is a chronic inflammatory disorder of the airways, affecting approximately 10% of children. About half the risk is genetically determined, but the rest we may have some control over. One of the reasons asthma rates may be rising is our rising rates of vitamin D deficiency. Kids just aren't going out to play anymore. A doubling of vitamin D insufficiency levels in recent years, such that less than a quarter of U.S. teens hit the mark. Vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin. We make no vitamin D from the light coming from our TV or computer screens. So do kids with lower vitamin D levels in their blood have worse asthma? Apparently so. One of more than a dozen observational studies suggesting that vitamin D is protective against asthma exacerbations. So should we start giving kids with asthma vitamin D supplements if they're not going to go outside? Well, correlation doesn't mean causation. For example, maybe severe asthma leads to less vitamin D instead of the other way around. To prove cause and effect, you need to
Put it to the test.
take kids with asthma and randomize them into one of two groups, vitamin D or an identical-looking sugar pill, and see what happens. The problem is that there were no such clinical studies like that
Until now.
Give asthmatic kids between 500 and 1,000 international units of vitamin D3 a day, and cut asthma exacerbations by more than half, perhaps by decreasing the incidence of respiratory infections by boosting immunity, while at the same time diminishing inflammation. Well, if it helps with inflammation, what about inflammatory bowel disease? Inflammatory bowel disease is a chronic inflammatory condition of the intestine that includes Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. If you compare identical twins, even though they have the same genes, most of the time if one twin has it, the other does not. So there must be some important non-genetic trigger factors. What might they be? Well, studies like this offered a clue. Why do those living in the southern United States have lower inflammatory bowel disease rates than those living in the north? Maybe it's because those living in the south get more sun, which means more vitamin D, which may mean less inflammation. So do those with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis with low vitamin D levels have worse disease? Apparently so, increased risk of surgery and hospitalization, and those who normalize their vitamin D levels appear to reduce their risk of relapse. But instead of better D leading to better Crohn's, maybe the better Crohn's led to better D. They felt so good they went outside more. You can't tell if it's cause and effect unless you
put it to the test.
First pilot study of its kind tried 1,000 units of vitamin D a day and saw no change in the Crohn's disease activity index, though at 6 weeks there may have been a slight increase in the inflammatory bowel disease quality of life scores, but even that disappeared by year's end. Pretty disappointing results. Maybe they didn't use enough. How about 1,200 international units a day? The relapse rate appeared to be cut in half, though there were too few people in the study to reach statistical significance. How about 2,000 a day? Gut leakiness, so-called intestinal permeability, continued to worsen in the placebo group, but appeared to stabilize in the vitamin D group, though only those who reached blood levels over 75 nanomoles per liter appeared to have a significant drop in inflammation. And indeed, if you start Crohn's patients on 1,000 and then ramp it up until they reach a target blood level, you can get a significant boost in quality of life, accompanying a significant drop in disease activity. Disease scores under 150 are considered remission, so the majority of patients achieved remission. With improvements in disease activity in all but one patient, this suggests that Crohn's patients may want to take 5,000 international units of vitamin D a day. But that's nearly 10 times the RDA. Why so much? Because that's what it may take to get normal vitamin D levels, as in normal for our species levels, the kinds of levels one might get running around half-naked in Africa, as we did for millions of years. In the 1940s and 50s, the American Medical Association was not only saying that smoking in moderation was not a problem, on balance it may even be beneficial. After all, most physicians themselves smoked, so how bad could it be? The American Medical Association is saying that where could you turn back then if you just wanted the facts? What's the new data advanced by science? Well, she was too tired for fun, and then she smoked a Camel. Babe Ruth spoke of proof positive medical science, that is, when he still could speak, before he died of throat cancer. Now, some of the science did leak out, causing a dip from about 11 cigarettes a day per person down to 10, but those who got scared could always choose the cigarette that takes the fear out of smoking, or even better, choose the cigarette that gives you the greatest health protection. Now, by some miracle, there was a smokingfacts.org website back then that could deliver the science directly to the people, bypassing commercially corruptible institutional filters. You would have become aware of studies like this, an Adventist study out of California in 1958 that showed that non-smokers may have at least 90% less lung cancer than smokers. Now, with so much money and personal habit at stake, there will always be dissenters, but look, given the seriousness of these diseases and the sum total of evidence, we shouldn't wait to put preventive measures in place. So, if you're a smoker in the 50s in the know, what do you do?
With access to the science, you realize the best available balance of evidence suggests your smoking habit not so good for you. So do you change, or do you wait? If you wait until your doctor tells you, between puffs, to quit, you could have cancer by then. If you wait until the powers that be officially recognize it, like the Surgeon General did in the subsequent decade, you could be dead by then.
It took more than 7,000 studies and the deaths of countless smokers before the first Surgeon General report against smoking was finally released in the 1960s.
You'd think maybe after the first 6,000 studies, they could have given people a little heads up or something? Powerful industry. One wonders how many people are currently suffering needlessly from dietary diseases.
Maybe we should have stopped smoking after the 700th study like this. Now let's fast forward 55 years. You know, there's a new Adventist study out of California warning America about the risks of something else they may be putting in their mouth. And it's not just one study. According to a recent review, the total sum of evidence suggests that mortality from all causes put together, many of our dread diseases, ischemic heart disease, circulatory, cerebrovascular disease like stroke, significantly lower among those eating more plant-based diets, in addition to less cancer and diabetes. So instead of someone going along with America's smoking habits in the 50s, imagine you or someone you know going along with America's eating habits in the present day. What do you do?
With access to the science, you realize the best available balance of evidence suggests your eating habits not so good for you. So do you change, or do you wait? If you wait until your doctor tells you between bites to change, it could be too late. Just like most doctors smoked back then, despite overwhelming evidence published for decades, most doctors today continue to eat foods that are contributing to our epidemics of dietary disease.